She stood at the door in the dark, soaked through, asking only for the barn. "You need to stay with this one," because what he offered instead changed the shape of both their lives. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? A woman at a stranger's door. A rancher who had not unlocked his guest room in 3 years. And a storm that had another 2 weeks left in it before anyone would know what anything meant. Rewind. His name was Calhoun Briggs, and he had spent the better part of 43 years learning that the land asked more of a man than a man usually thought he had. The ranch sat in a long fold of high prairie between 2 ridges, 11 miles from the nearest town, which was called Sutler's Crossing, and which contained a post office, a feed merchant, a lawyer named Devereaux, and not much else that mattered. Calhoun had come to this land with his wife, Miriam, 14 years earlier, when both of them had been young enough to believe that stubborn work was sufficient answer to any question the country might put. They had broken ground on the house themselves, hauling timber in 2 wagon loads from the mill town to the south. They had planted the kitchen garden in the second spring. They had counted 7 profitable years, 2 lean ones, and 4 that were simply ordinary, which Miriam said was its own kind of grace. Miriam had been dead for 3 years now. A fever in the October. 9 days from the first chill to the last breath. And Calhoun had sat with her through all 9 of them and had gone on sitting in the chair beside the empty bed. For some hours after the end, before he understood there was no longer any point to sitting there. He had risen. He had done the chores. He had kept doing the chores every morning after that, because the cattle did not suspend their needs for grief, and because if he stopped moving, he was not sure what would happen, but was equally sure he did not want to find out. He had a hired hand named Pogue, who came 3 days a week from town, a lean man of 60, who said almost nothing and asked for nothing beyond his wage and the occasional use of Calhoun's better hacksaw. He had a neighbor, Tilson Hare, whose property ran along the north fence, and who appeared perhaps once a month to discuss fence line and fence line only, and whose company Calhoun found entirely adequate. He had the postmistress, Vera Oakes, who handed him his mail with a look of cautious inventory each time, as if she were checking that his parts were all still attached. These 3 were the human world Calhoun moved through, and he had concluded, without self-pity and without illusion, that this was sufficient. He had not reopened the guest room. He had told himself it was because no guest was expected. This was technically true. The storm had been building for 3 days before it broke. Calhoun could read weather the way some men read print, in the specific quality of light on the western ridge, and in the smell of the air at the stock tank, and he had brought everything in early and banked the fire. He did this every serious storm. It was not hospitality exactly. It was more like a contract he kept with the open country, the acknowledgement that in 11 miles of empty prairie, a light mattered. The knock came at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in the first week of November, which was the 14th day of the storm season, as Calhoun counted such things, and the 3rd day of continuous rain. He had been awake, unable to settle, reading the same page of an almanac for the 5th time. He heard the knock and sat still for a moment, because his first instinct, which he trusted less than he used to, told him no one was out in this. Then he took up the rifle from its place by the door, not in anger, but in the habit of a man who had learned that the country did not distinguish between the innocent and the unlucky. He opened the door. She was standing on the porch boards in the full run of rain that the overhang barely turned, a woman perhaps 30 years old, or 32, with dark hair plastered flat and a coat that had given up being waterproof somewhere. She was holding a saddlebag across her chest with both arms the way a person holds a thing they will not let go of, regardless of what else is happening to them. She looked at the rifle with eyes that registered it, and then moved past it to his face, which Calhoun found unsettling in a way he could not immediately name. She said, "I am not looking for trouble. I only want to ask if I might sleep in your barn." Calhoun stood in the door for 3 seconds, which was long enough to see that she was shaking, and that the shaking was cold and not fear, that her boots were ruined, that she was exhausted in the specific cellular way of someone who has been pushing past the point of sense for a number of hours, and that she was still holding herself straight. He said, "Step inside." She said, "The barn is fine." He said, "The barn is not fine. Step inside." She stepped inside. He put the rifle back without ceremony and went to the fire and put another length of wood on it. And while he did this, he was aware of her standing just inside the door and dripping onto the entry boards and not moving further into the room, because she had not been invited further and was the kind of person who paid attention to such distinctions. He found this notable. He said, "There's a hook behind you. Coat on it, boots off." She complied without argument. He went to the cabinet and found the spare wool blanket that had lived there since before Miriam, since before everything, and brought it back and held it out. She took it with both hands and wrapped it around her shoulders. And the shaking began, in the way shaking sometimes begins only after the emergency is technically over, as if the body had been waiting for permission. Her name, she told him when she had both hands around a cup of strong black tea, was Nadia Voss. She had come from the valley to the east, from a property there called the Ketterman Place, though she added quickly that she had no claim to it. She had been a hired manager there, she said, for the past 2 years, working for a man named Orvis Ketterman, who had died in the September, and who had, in his dying, asked her to carry something to Calhoun Briggs of the Briggs Ranch, 11 miles east of Sutler's Crossing. She had set out 3 days ago. Her horse had thrown a shoe in the second storm, and she had walked the last 6 miles. Calhoun set his cup down. He said, "You knew Orvis," she said. He said you were the most honest man in 2 counties and the most difficult, and that he meant both as compliments. Orvis Ketterman had been Calhoun's partner in the early years, a lean, dry-humored man who had helped Calhoun survey the original fence lines and who had staked him in the hard second year when the money ran low. With a loan of $430 that Calhoun had paid back in full within 18 months, and which Orvis had accepted without comment or ceremony, as a man accepts the return of a thing he always expected to get back. They had worked neighboring land for 11 years. Orvis had known Miriam. He had come to the burial and had said nothing at it, which was the right thing, and had shown up 2 weeks later with a load of fence posts that needed setting, which was also the right thing, and Calhoun had never forgotten either. Orvis had been sick since the spring. Calhoun had known it. He had not known until this moment that it had ended. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You walked 6 miles in this," she said. She opened the saddlebag on the table between them, and from inside an oilskin wrapping that had kept it dry, she produced a folded document and a sealed envelope. The document was a property instrument, handwritten and witnessed by a notary in the county seat, transferring to Calhoun Briggs certain grazing rights along the Eastern Creek boundary, rights that Orvis had held for 30 years, and that were worth in practical terms the difference between a marginal summer and a profitable one. The sealed envelope had Calhoun's name on it in Orvis's cramped hand. He did not open it at the table. He said, "You'll take the guest room." She said, "I don't want to impose." He said, "It's not an imposition, it's a room." There was a small silence. She looked at him over her cup with those eyes that registered things, and moved on, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." He showed her the room. He had not opened the door in 3 years. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint cedar smell of the chest in the corner that Miriam had brought from her mother's house. He lit the lamp on the nightstand. The bed was made. He was not sure why. He left her to it and went back to the fire and sat in his chair and held the sealed envelope for a long time before he opened it. Orvis's letter was not long. It was written in the careful, slightly labored hand of a man who had been composing it over weeks rather than hours, who had gone back and added things and crossed others out and gone back again. He wrote that the grazing rights were Calhoun's without condition, old debts and old friendship, needing no ceremony. He wrote that the property itself was going to a nephew in the East who had never seen it. He wrote about Miriam with a plainness that made Calhoun look away from the page for a moment and then look back. Then he wrote about Nadia Voss. He wrote that she had come to him 2 years ago from a considerable distance and a considerable difficulty, that she had managed his property with a capability and an honesty that he had rarely encountered, that she had treated his last hard months with a dignity he had not asked for and could not repay. He wrote that she was, in his estimation, exactly as capable as she appeared, and that she was also in a position that she would not describe as desperate, but which was, in practical fact, exactly that. The Eastern property was going to the nephew. There was no position for her there. She had savings enough for perhaps 3 months, which she would not mention and would not spend on herself until she had no other option. Orvis wrote, "I am not asking you to take on a charity case because she is not one and she would not stand for it. I am asking you to look at what you have and look at what she has and see if the arithmetic comes out to something reasonable. She is proud and she is worth her pride. She will not ask for more than a barn. I think you can do better than a barn." At the bottom, in a slightly shakier hand, as if written last, there is a second reason. She went to the trouble of walking 6 miles in a storm. I expect you will discover it in time. I expect you will find it answers a question you have not yet thought to ask. Calhoun folded the letter and set it on the table and looked at the fire. He was a man who had learned to think methodically, who went at problems the way he went at fence repair. Walk the whole line before you pick up the first tool. Know where the break is before you decide how to fix it. He thought about what he had, the ranch, 1,100 acres, more cattle than one man managed comfortably, the grazing rights that were now his, and which would mean a better summer if he could work them. He thought about what the winter looked like, which was long. He thought about the spare room. He thought about Orvis Ketterman, who had never, in 11 years of close acquaintance, made a suggestion that did not eventually prove correct. He went to bed. In the morning, the rain was still coming down, and she was already up. He found her in the kitchen when he came down before dawn, not touching anything that was not hers to touch, standing at the window with her cup looking out at the rain on the yard, with the focused, assessing look of someone reading a property for the first time. She had found the coffee which was within her rights, and she had made enough for two without making any particular point of it. He poured a cup. He said, "Sleep?" She said, "Some." He said, "I need to check the east fence line this morning. Ground will be soft." She said, "I'll come." He looked at her. She said, "I know, fence line." They went out together into the gray rain, Calhoun in his oilskin, and Nadia in a coat he lent her that was too large in the shoulders, and which she rolled at the cuffs without comment. The east fence ran for 3/4 of a mile along a slope that the rain was running fast, and the ground was exactly as soft as he had predicted, and in 2 places the post had shifted. He began at the first one, working the post back to plumb with the bar and the mallet, and she worked beside him without instruction, reading what needed doing and doing it, packing the ground back tight, testing the tension of the wire with her hand after. She worked with the specific economy of someone who had done it before, not in demonstration but in plain competence, and at no point suggested she was doing him any favor. He let her work. By the 3rd day of her being in the house, she had begun to be useful in ways that went beyond what he had offered her, which was room and board while the storm lasted, and her horse's shoe was seen to. She reorganized the tool shed in a way that he recognized as objectively superior to his own arrangement, and then said nothing about having done it. She fixed the latch on the chicken coop that had been stiff for 2 seasons, with a piece of wire in 5 minutes and a particular kind of patience. She cooked in the evenings, not elaborately, but well, with a plain competence that reminded him in a general way of Miriam, without being in any specific way like her. He had begun to open the almanac in the evenings again, the one he had been failing to read. Sometimes she read, too, from a small volume she had in the saddlebag, and the evenings were quiet in the way that the house had not been quiet for 3 years, which was to say they were quiet with another person in them. By the end of the first week he had made her a proposal of employment, wages for the winter season, room and board included, with the understanding that the arrangement could be discussed again in the spring. He stated the wage precisely, $22 a month, which was what Pogue received and which Pogue had never complained about. She looked at him for a moment and said that was fair, and said yes, and that was that. By the middle of the second week, they had begun to find the edges of each other's silences. He knew that she woke early and was at her best before noon, and needed quiet in the late afternoon. She knew that he worked through problems by going outside and doing something physical, and that questions asked during the doing received better answers than questions asked at the table. They simply began to navigate around them, and the navigating itself was a kind of conversation. She knew, it turned out, a language he had never encountered, spoken in a region far to the east of where she had grown up, and on the 9th evening she said a phrase in it without thinking, an exclamation in response to knocking over her cup, and when he looked at her she told him what it meant and something about where it came from. and he asked a question about it, and she answered, and the conversation continued for an hour, into territory he had not visited in some time, which was the territory of curiosity, of wanting to know a thing, not because it was useful. She had grown up speaking two languages, the one of that region and the one they spoke now, and had learned a third through work. And she listened to his speech and told him once, with the slight smile she deployed rarely. He did not know what to do with this, and said nothing, which was his custom, when he did not know what to do with a thing. The storm continued for 12 more days after her arrival, 14 days in total from her first knock at the door, and, by the end of those 14 days, the ranch had a different texture. The work was getting done in a different way, not faster exactly, but more fully, with fewer things falling to the edge of the list, because there were 2 people making the list and 2 people working it. The cattle were in better condition going into deep winter than they had been in 2 years. The house smelled of cooking and wood smoke and the cedar of the open guest room, and also of the particular green herbal soap she used, which he noticed without making a point of noticing. On the evening of the 14th day, the rain stopped. They stood on the porch together and watched the sky clear from the west, the clouds pulling back in long streaks to show the stars, which were the particular winter stars of that latitude, sharp and unmoved by anything that had happened below them. The land was sodden and still, and the creek was high, and the silence after 2 weeks of rain was almost loud. He stood with his hands in his pockets. She stood with her arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the easy way of someone comfortable in the cold. He thought about Orvis's letter. The second reason, he had been thinking about it with some frequency in the background of the days, the way a man thinks about a fence problem he has not yet walked to, knowing it is there, not yet ready to look at it directly. On the 16th day after her arrival, Pogue came to work as he did on his 3-day rotation, and found the east fence in better order than he had ever seen it, and the tool shed reorganized, and a woman he did not know working the stock tank with a calm efficiency. He looked at this and then looked at Calhoun and said nothing, which was his way of saying quite a lot. On the 19th day, a man came from town. His name was Fenton Crawl. He arrived at mid-morning in a good coat, which was not a working coat, and with a man behind him who had the look of someone hired more for size than for skill. Calhoun was splitting wood and set down the maul when he saw them come up the track, not in alarm, but with the specific attentiveness he gave to anything that arrived uninvited. Fenton Crawl said he was an agent acting on behalf of a party he called the Consolidated Range and Title Company, which had offices in the territorial capital and which held, he said, a debt instrument signed by the late Orvis Ketterman against certain grazing rights along the Eastern Creek boundary. The debt, he said, was in the amount of $350, and upon Orvis Ketterman's death, the debt had transferred to the collateral, which was the grazing rights themselves, and as Calhoun was now holding those rights by instrument of a dead man, the company had a legitimate claim against Calhoun's use of that land until the matter was settled. Calhoun listened to all of this without expression. Then he said, "I'd want to see that instrument." Calhoun looked at it. The document was dated to a period 18 months before Orvis's death, and bore a signature that resembled Orvis's hand and the stamp of a notary, whose name Calhoun did not recognize. He said, "I'll need some time to look this over." Crawl said, Of course. I'll return in a week. I expect we can settle this without difficulty. The man behind him said nothing and looked at the property with the particular look of a man who has been asked to assess a thing. Calhoun said, "I'll see you in a week." They left. Nadia had been at the corner of the barn during this exchange, not visibly so, and she came to him when they had gone, with her arms folded and her face in that careful, registering mode. He said, "I know Orvis would have told me about a debt of that size." She said, "He had no such debt. Not to any company. I kept his accounts." $350 is not a number that appeared anywhere. He looked at her. She said, "I kept copies." He said, "Of course you did." They went inside and she opened the saddlebag, the same one she had carried 6 miles in the storm, and from a compartment in its lining she produced a set of pages that were the account records of the Ketterman operation for the past 2 years. Neat columns, in her careful hand, income and expenditure, every number dated and sourced. There was no debt instrument. There was no payment to any consolidated range and title company. There was a margin note at the end of the most recent page in Orvis's own handwriting. Not about numbers, just 3 words. Calhoun read those 3 words and was quiet for a moment. He said, he knew. She said, he knew. They would come, he told me, 2 weeks before he died. He said if anyone came to you about a debt against those grazing rights, the debt was false, and the account records were the answer. This was, Calhoun understood, the second reason. Not only the grazing rights, not only the fair arrangement Orvis had mapped out for 2 people he trusted, but this. The one person who could document the truth of Orvis's accounts had been sent, with those accounts to the only man Orvis believed would handle what was coming with sufficient stubbornness and sufficient honesty to see it through. Orvis had planned it from a sick bed, with the methodical care of a man who knew he would not be there to see the result and who trusted the people he was arranging things for to be equal to the situation. Calhoun thought, "You always could see further than the rest of us." "Orvis," he said to Nadia, "I need to go to town." She said, "I'll come." He started to say that was not necessary and stopped, because it was, in fact, necessary, because she was the one who had kept the accounts and she was the one who could speak to them, and because the idea of leaving her at the ranch while a man like Krall was circling felt against his grain in a way he did not yet have a name for. He said, "Yes, come." They rode to Settlers Crossing, 11 miles on a road that was still soft from the storm, and went first to the lawyer Devereaux, who was a small, precise man of 65 who had handled land documents in the county for 31 years. Interesting problem. Devereaux examined the account records and the property instrument and the document Krall had presented from his own copy of it, which Calhoun had thought to ask for. He took some time with this. He said after 20 minutes that the notary stamp on the Krall document corresponded to a notary who had lost his commission the previous year for irregularities in exactly this kind of instrument, which was a thing the Consolidated Range and Title Company. He said that the property instrument from Orvis, properly witnessed and filed, was prior in date and primary in standing, and that the Krall instrument, given the notary's status, was essentially worthless as a legal document. He said the account records were precisely what was needed to demonstrate that the underlying debt had never existed. He said, "This is a company that has done this in 3 other counties." They picked recently transferred land and recently deceased owners, and they fabricate instruments against the collateral. They count on people not having the documentation to contest it or not having the stubbornness. Calhoun said, "I have both." Devereaux looked at Nadia with open respect. He said, "These records are exceptionally well kept." She said, "Thank you." Devereaux said he would file the relevant challenge with the county recorder that afternoon and would send notice to the company's office in the capital. He said, "When Krall comes back, tell him to speak to me." They rode back in the late afternoon light, which was the first clear afternoon light in 3 weeks, and which lay across the wet prairie in long gold bars that made the land look like. Neither of them talked much on the road. The horses moved at an easy walk. The silence between them had, over 19 days, shifted from the cautious kind to the other kind. And the other kind was not nothing. That evening he cooked, which he had not done since she arrived, not because she had taken it from him, but because he had found reasons not to, and now found a reason to. He made a plain supper, nothing elaborate, but he made it with attention. She sat at the table and watched him with the quiet inventory look and said nothing, until he set the plate in front of her, at which point she said thank you, in the language of that distant region, a phrase she had taught him in the second week, which he understood now, and which meant something closer to "I receive this with both hands." He said it back to her. She looked up from her plate, and the look on her face was not surprise exactly. It was something that had been waiting behind the careful surface, and that came briefly to the front, and then she looked back at her plate. And the supper continued in quiet. He had been working toward a question for several days. He was a man who did not ask questions until he knew what he was asking, and he had needed the time to understand what he was asking, to separate obligation from choice in his own mind with the same care he would give to separating a bona fide instrument. He did not want to offer her a thing because Orvis had suggested it. He wanted to offer her a thing because it was what he had actually concluded, on his own accounting, was correct. The arithmetic, as Orvis had put it, came out to something reasonable. But reasonable was not the same as chosen, and chosen was the thing that mattered. On the 23rd day after she had knocked at his door in the storm, he found her at the east fence line at dusk, doing a final check on the posts they had reset, running the wire between her fingers the way you check wire, feeling for weakness. The sky in the west was the deep orange of a late November evening, very clear after the weeks of rain, and the creek along the boundary was still high and loud. She did not hear him approach over it. Then he said her name. She turned. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly." She set the wire down and looked at him with her full attention, which was a substantial thing to be the object of. He said, "I know what Orvis wrote. I know what his thinking was, and I think his thinking was sound. But it's not his decision. I've been 3 weeks working out what I think, separate from what he thought. And I've come out in the same place, but by my own road." She said nothing. He said, "This place runs better with you in it. You know it, and I know it. That's practical. But that's not all of it." He stopped. She said, "Say the rest." He said, "I would like you to stay. Not as an employee, as a partner in the full sense." She said, "That is a serious thing to offer." He said, "I know what I'm offering." She was quiet for what felt like a long time, and he stood in it without flinching, which was the only thing he knew how to do. She said, "I have my own name." He said, "You'll keep it." She said, "I'm not an easy person." He said, "I didn't ask for easy." She said, "All right." He said, "All right." They stood at the fence line in the last of the light, and neither of them said anything further, because nothing further wanted saying. And after a time, they walked back to the house together, in the dark. The following week, they went to town again. Devereaux drew up the partnership agreement first, a legal document that specified the arrangement with the precision that Calhoun required, and that named Nadia Voss as co-owner of the Eastern grazing rights, which was the legal protection that mattered if anything came back from the direction of Krall or his company. Then they went to see the county clerk, a woman named Halverson, who had held the position for 22 years, and who registered the marriage with a brief ceremony and a handshake, and a look at both of them that was approving without being sentimental. Vera Oakes at the post office, who had been watching Calhoun's parts for 3 years, saw them come out of the clerk's office together and had the expression of a woman whose long-held professional concern. Fenton Krall came back on the 28th day as he had threatened, and he brought 4 men this time rather than 1, which was the escalation that had always been coming, and he stood in the yard with the confidence of a man who expected the numbers to settle the argument. Calhoun met him at the gate. Nadia stood beside him. Behind them, visible because they had been asked to be, were Pogue and Tilson Hare with his 2 oldest sons. Devereaux had also come, because Devereaux had wanted to, and he stood slightly apart, with the posture of a man who has a document in his coat pocket that he is prepared to produce. Krall looked at this assembly with a calculation running behind his eyes. He said, "I've come about the matter of the debt." Calhoun said, "My lawyer has filed with the county recorder and with the capital. The notary on your instrument lost his commission last year for exactly this kind of work. The debt doesn't exist in any ledger of the Ketterman estate, and we have those ledgers. You're welcome to take it to the territorial court if you think you have a case." Krall looked at Devereaux. Devereaux looked back at him without expression, but with a great deal of compressed patience. Krall looked at the 4 men behind Calhoun. He said, "This isn't finished." Calhoun said, "Yes, it is." It was, in fact. The Consolidated Range and Title Company. When Devereaux's filing arrived at the Capitol alongside a second filing, from a lawyer in the next county who had encountered the same scheme 3 months prior, found itself under a scrutiny it had not planned for and which resolved over the following 6 weeks, when, a manner that left its principals with significantly fewer options than they had started with. Krall did not come back. The 4 men left first, and then Krall turned his horse and followed them, and the yard was quiet again, and the thin winter light lay across it unchanged. Tilson Hare nodded at Calhoun in the way that Tilson communicated everything, which was a single short nod that meant, "Right." Then he loaded his sons back into the wagon and left. Pogue went back to the tool shed. Devereaux shook hands with both Calhoun and Nadia, lingering fractionally longer on Nadia's hand in acknowledgment of the account records, and drove back to town. The yard was theirs. Winter came in full, and the ranch absorbed it, the way a sound building absorbs weather by holding. The days were short and cold, and there was work in them from before the dawn to after the dark, and the work got done. They found in the shortening days a rhythm that suited both of them, the early hours productive, and the evenings slow. He taught her the particular mathematics of the cattle inventory, the way he tracked condition and weight by observation rather than scale, and she received the instruction the way a capable person receives instruction, without performance. She taught him over many evenings a substantial portion of her Eastern language, enough that he could follow a sentence and construct a simple one, and she was an exacting teacher who did not give credit for approximate pronunciation, which he respected. She had brought in the saddlebag a small practice she had maintained for many years, which was a particular form of intricate paper cutting that her grandmother had taught her, a means of making images from a single sheet. She did this in the evenings by the lamp, and the results accumulated on the windowsill above the kitchen table, translucent and geometric and occasionally figurative, small cranes and lattice patterns. Calhoun looked at this one for a long time, and then said it was very accurate, and she said she had been looking at that ridge for 2 months, and it was time to get it down. There was a night in January, 3 months after the storm, when the temperature dropped to a number that required both of them to check the younger cattle through the night, and they took the checks in shifts, and he slept briefly between and woke when she came in from the cold. And he watched her from the half-dark of the room, doing this, crouched at the hearth with her hair loose, entirely concentrated on the catching of the kindling, and he thought about what Orvis had written. I expect you will find it answers a question you have not yet thought to ask. He understood now what the question had been, though he had not known to ask it. The question was what he had been doing for 3 years with a made bed in an unopened room. He had been waiting, in the way a man waits, without knowing he is waiting, for the room to have a reason again. The refrain that Orvis's letter had lodged in him, the aphorism that had turned in his mind through the whole of the winter, was this: a debt looked after becomes simply a life. He had thought about it a great deal. It had started as something Orvis said in a context that was about obligation, about the original loan of $430, and about the way Calhoun had paid it back in full, and how their friendship had then become something that needed no accounting because there was no imbalance in it. But it had changed meaning over the months, or rather the months had revealed that it had always meant something larger, that a thing you take on carefully, with full attention, stops being a weight and becomes the shape of your days. The cattle were not a burden. The land was not a burden. And the woman who had knocked at his door in the storm and asked for only the barn, and had gotten instead the best room in the house, was not an obligation. The spring came the way. Spring always came to that latitude, grudgingly, and then all at once the creek dropping from its winter high to its spring-running clarity, the south-facing slopes showing the first green in the second week of March, the mornings still cold, but with a different quality of cold. Cold. Calhoun walked the east fence line in the third week of March, the way he walked it at the start of every season, checking what the winter had done, and Nadia walked it with him, and the grazing land along the creek was as good as Orvis had always said it was, dark and rich and ready. He thought about Orvis on that walk. He thought about Miriam. The grief for Miriam was not gone, had not been replaced, but it had changed its character in the way that grief changes when a life resumes around it, becoming less a wound and more a scar, present and part of the shape of you, but no longer the whole story of how you move. He did not think Miriam would have found this wrong. He thought she would have found it correct. She had always been the one who said that simplification was not a virtue in itself, that calling loneliness simplicity. He had known she was right. He had just needed longer to agree. They stood at the eastern boundary, at the place where the fence met the creek, on a morning in late March, with the light coming in low from the east and the water moving fast and clear below them. The ridge on the far side of the creek threw a long shadow that would shorten as the morning went on. Nadia was reading the fence line, one hand on the top wire, and a paper cutout silhouette on the kitchen windowsill was in his mind, and also the way she had said I received this with both hands on the night he had cooked, and also the account records in the oilskin-wrapped saddlebag Dot brought 6 miles through the dark in a storm because a man she had respected asked her to, and because she was not the kind of person who came to a thing without what she needed to be useful. He said, "It's a good piece of land." She said, "It is." He said, "Orvis knew what he had." She said, "He knew what he was giving." There was a long silence, the creek loud in it, the birds in the willow scrub along the bank beginning their morning argument. She turned from the fence and looked at him, and the look had in it everything the winter had built, the fence posts and the account records, and the evenings with the paper and the scissors, and the long nights of cold check rounds, and the single all right spoken at dusk by the fence line in November. He said, "A debt looked after becomes simply a life." She said, "Is that Orvis?" He said, "It's Orvis. It's also true." She nodded, which was her complete assent. They walked back along the fence line toward the house, and the shadow of the ridge shortened as the sun came up, and the land on both sides of the wire was theirs, not because they had taken it from anyone, but because they had shown up for it. The best room in the house had been unlocked. Not because a woman had asked to sleep in the barn, but because the house had needed someone in it who would stay, and she had needed a place that would hold. The two facts had come together in the dark, in a storm, at a door, with a rifle set aside, and a kettle put on, and a blanket given with both hands. That was the small moment. That was the one that changed everything.